Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Alan Watke, the Deputy Director of Events here at Politics and Prose, where we now host in-person events again, and along with some virtual events here and there. And we also do partnered events and supported events, and then we also have a whole line of classes and trips that we promote. For a full list of everything, you can go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get going, I want to ask you all to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. And we have lifted the mask mandate, but if you feel like you do want to wear one, we have some available back at the front of the store by the door. When we get to the Q&A section, we're going to ask everyone to please come up to this microphone by the pillar on your right, because we are filming it and live streaming it, so we want the questions to get picked up for the event. And then when we get to the end, we're gonna have a signing right here at this table, so if you could line up at that pillar as well. For that, we'll get your books personalized. And then once the event is over, if you could fold up your chairs and lean them against something solid, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. So without further ado, we're excited to welcome Nicholas Reynolds, celebrating Need to Know, World War II and the Rise of American Intelligence. Nicholas has worked in the fields of modern military history and intelligence off and on for 40 years with some unusual detours. With a freshly minted PhD from Oxford University in hand, he joined the Marine Corps in the 70s, serving as an infantry officer and then as a historian. As a colonel in the reserves, he eventually became officer in charge of field history, deploying historians around the world to capture history as it was being made. When not on duty with the Marine Corps, he served as a CIA officer at home and abroad, immersing himself in the very human business of espionage. Most recently, he was the historian for the CIA Museum, responsible for developing its strategic plan and helping to turn remarkable artifacts into compelling stories. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller Writer, Sailor, Soldier, Spy, and he currently teaches as an adjunct professor for Johns Hopkins University, and with his wife Becky, he cares for rescue pugs. Reynolds will be joined in conversation with Dr. Andrew Hammond, historian and curator of the International Spy Museum, where he hosts the podcast Spycast and is a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. He's taught international relations and modern history at institutions on both sides of the Atlantic and has supplied expert commentary to outlets such as BBC News, CNN, Sky News Arabia, among others. His forthcoming book, Struggles for Freedom, U.S. Foreign Policy and Afghanistan since 1979, will be released later this year. Is that true? This year? Is it still coming out?
Maybe next year.
Okay. And is working on another book that tells the story of 9/11 and the global war on terror through the voices of military and intelligence veterans. And so now, in partnership with the International Spy Museum, we'd like to welcome Nicholas Reynolds and Dr. Andrew Hammond. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here, and what a fantastic achievement finishing this book on such a large and important area. The first question I want to ask, just to get warmed up, Nick, what was more difficult, doing a PhD at Oxford, going through Marine training, or training to become a CIA officer? I'll just repeat the question. Can you hear me now? Yeah. So what was more difficult, doing a PhD at Oxford, going through Marine training, or becoming a CIA officer? Which was more difficult?
That's a great question, and it's apples and oranges, because each one was difficult in its own way. Probably the most pleasant one was doing a PhD at Oxford, because I like to read and write. and it's a wonderful place to read and write, and the surroundings are amazing. The people who show up for dinner, that's part of your education there, is who shows up for dinner. So it would be a toss-up between the Marine Corps and the CIA for tough training, for different reasons, really.
Well, let's get on to your book. What led you to write this book?
So why did I do this? I'm gonna start by I need to thank you all for coming. I need to single out a couple of people. The gentleman in the baseball hat there is Mark Bradley, an accomplished author in his own right. And Mark kind of started me down the road of writing books at this stage of my life by showing me what he was doing on a book called a man called Duncan Lee, who was a remarkable spy for the Soviets. And so I need to shout out to Jay Venables here, who was with me on this book almost from the first day to the last as editor, copy editor, proofreader, therapist, you name it. And it's a lonely business, as the writers in the crowd will know. And at least I have one person who I could reach out to and say, hey, that semicolon, that's wrong, isn't it? And she would understand. Of course, there's Becky, who had to put up with 3 books now, right? 3, yeah, but, and somehow we made it work during the pandemic, because we're still married, yeah. So my my thanks to them, I think, is Gil Barndaller in the house. And Gil was one of my readers, so special thanks to him, and of course to Andrew for being here and speaking about. So one more reader was a gentleman named Paul Nevin, who's not here tonight, but there are some people in the house who know him. So a shout out to Paul for being a great reader and really a remarkable amateur editor. Could have been pro, don't you think? Yeah, okay. Anyway, so welcome and thank you for coming. So the question, I didn't answer the question yet. So why am I doing this? Why did I do this? So we start with World War II. And my parents were both in World War II in unusual capacities. My mother was in Hungary. She spent the latter part of the war in a bunker in Budapest as the Russians and Germans fought over the city. My dad was in the American Foreign Service, and he was part of a group that was looking for captured German documents as the front would advance. This team would go behind it and look for German documents that had been stored or hidden. World War II was a presence in our house, and not every day, every minute, but there were little reminders here and there. That you fast forward, I go to college. One of the things I like to read about most is World War II, and I start becoming semi-pro, get a PhD, wind up in the archives with people like Paul Kennedy and David Kahn. And David Kahn became a lifelong friend, and I really got to do a big shout out to him, because he told me one day, he says, nobody's ever written a sort of a general history of American intelligence in World War II. No, there's a bunch of books on American intelligence in World War II, but they each take a slice of the subject. And so nobody's written like a little bit of this discipline, a little bit of that discipline, and tried to figure out how they related to each other.
How difficult was it to do a crossover book where you're looking at all of the different agencies involved?
So that's another great question. So how difficult was it to do a crossover? The answer is pretty difficult, because I'm only semi-organized. So I would start doing something, and then I go, well, there's too much of this and there's not enough of that, and why don't we? So it's a matter of rebalancing. I'm not an outliner, so I do think chronologically. So there was kind of but you had to switch back and forth between the various disciplines and the various places. So you might talk about the Navy in the Pacific and the guys in the bunker at Pearl Harbor, but then you had to explain what was going on in the Atlantic, and you had to explain what the Army was doing more or less the same time, and then you had to try and make it a thread, right? Try and connect one to the other. So yes, it was difficult, and there are people who are going to go, well, why didn't you do this or that? And I don't think you can in one volume. You're going to make some choices, and otherwise you write like 4 or 5 volumes, and and that's not bad, but it's different.
Or you write like Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers.
Right. Yeah. So you have a grand
1,200
sweep.
pages.
So I'm sort of in between the really grand sweep or the really exhaustive, like Hinsley's British Intelligence in World War II, which I think is 5 volumes. So I'm somewhere in between. Tried to keep it to 1 volume, and to make it readable, but also scholarly.
And can everybody hear me up the back? I'm not sure if this needs to go up or I need to shout more. Okay, I'm going to shout more. Okay. Okay, so the next question is, I want to get a sense of the narrative arc of American intelligence. So where is American intelligence when the war begins?
So what I like to say is American intelligence, when the war began, is a cottage industry, or a set of cottage industries with individual craftsmen working more or less on their own, and not really talking to each other, and oftentimes not even aware of what the craftsman down the road was doing. By the end of the war, we see the beginning of an industry. American intelligence is an industry. You see a lot more people involved. You see a lot more machinery. It's just amazing. You see different kinds of people. The Army and the Navy intelligence in Washington, D.C. Employ something like a third to a half of its employees here are women. The Navy in part, it's in part because they won't send women overseas, so they can stay here and do what the men used to do. The Army's a little more liberal.
And one of the things that I find quite interesting is the role that American cryptography plays in the war. Can you tell us a little bit more about that story? I just think it's so fascinating, from Midway, Pearl Harbor, Purple. Help our audience understand that.
Okay, so that's a question I get a lot, which is, so I'm a human guy, okay? So I work for CIA, and what I did basically was espionage or staffing espionage. So it was about people and getting secrets out of them and processing those secrets. Code making and code breaking is quite a different kind of activity. And as people look at my book, I get as much or more interest in that than in espionage. So they are, at the beginning of the war, they're some of the craftsmen working on their own. And the achievements of American intelligence before Pearl Harbor are amazing, because they're basically working with a yellow pad and a pencil and trying to puzzle out things like the Japanese diplomatic code, which is the big achievement before Pearl Harbor. And so first with the yellow pad and the pencil, they figure out what the code is, and then they reverse engineer the machine that produced the code, and they do this on their own time, right? They like to tinker. They take things home, they work in the basement or in the garage, and they put it together. And one of the guys is Frank Rowlett, and Frank is from Virginia, and he likes to say he's just a country boy. He's just a simple lad. But he's a brilliant mathematician, and he's a brilliant engineer, and he reverse engineers the machine. Then around halfway through the war, or maybe after the war, somebody goes, could we see Rowlett's clearances, please? And he doesn't have any. He doesn't have any clearances because the system doesn't exist at that point. He's part of the group that makes that creates the profession. So this gets increasingly complicated as the war goes on, but they get better at it. So they get better at the technology, and then they get better at processing the take, because what you get before the war is basically, so the decision maker sees a telegram, sees the same telegram that the intended recipient sees. So the Japanese ambassador gets a telegram saying, send the dependents home, and so they translate that, they decode it, translate it, and then they show that to President Roosevelt, and he doesn't see any analysis, and he doesn't know, and he sees that day's take, right? So he doesn't remember necessarily what was yesterday, and he doesn't know of any trends. And the Army's very good about this. The Army hires a Wall Street lawyer named Alfred McCormick, and McCormick brings order to this and creates a system so that you can know where in the, so that you can see the bigger picture, so that you can see the context.
And I know that this is, there's moving parts here, but what does American intelligence look like during the war? Who are the main agencies? Who are the main players? Tell us how this all shakes out.
So you got the Army, so Army code breaking and Navy code breaking. And then you've got a difficult relationship between the code breakers, the guys who actually intercept and decode, and their services intelligence organizations, who are, so one of the disciplines is technological, the other is softer. It's maybe like being a historian. And they're supposed to look at the big picture and turn out the finished product. So so you've got Army, and you got the code breakers and the intelligence offices. Then you've got OSS, which is the Office of Strategic Services. It's the precursor of CIA, and that's a whole story in itself. They're the new kid on the block. The code breakers have been around for a bit, but the idea that America should have an intelligence agency is new, and it's kind of a struggle. Yet another player is the FBI, and it's involved in counterintelligence and catching spies, and it also wants to get involved in active espionage, and that's problematic. So I think I've covered most of it. You also see I don't do too much with things like aerial reconnaissance, but that's a big part of the picture too.
And the ultimate users of the intelligence are Churchill and Roosevelt, people like this. And you mentioned the differences between both of them as consumers of intelligence. Can you reflect on that a little bit more?
So Churchill and Roosevelt as consumers of intelligence. Churchill is a guy who's been in the business since the turn of the 20th century. Right, he has been part of the British government. He has been in office. He's been in Parliament. He was present at the creation, more or less, of MI5, which is the British Internal Service, MI6, which is the External Service. Besides going to school with these guys, being in the same regiment, being in the same clubs and whatnot. So he's really at the top of his game, even though he's 60-some when the war starts. I can't remember. He's in his 60s.
Yeah.
But he's got an amazing amount of energy and knowledge, and he brings it to bear actively. Roosevelt is a consummate politician, and he never really develops a feel for intelligence. He regards we talked a minute ago about all the various intelligence agencies. He regards them the way he might regard compatible but not identical political interests. So, so you can have a little bit of this, and you can have a little bit of that, and he's not as good at bringing the pieces together and harnessing everybody to the same end.
And obviously we have Pearl Harbor and Midway as turning points, but what are some of the other pivotal moments or teaching moments for American intelligence during the war?
So I like to talk about the Atlantic War, and one of the interesting things about that basically the German Navy does a really good job of sinking Allied shipping, and this is of supreme concern, especially to the British. The name of the game is to get the convoys, get the goods from the United States to the UK, and how best to do that. And the British are very good at breaking the German codes, and so what they like to do is reroute the convoys, because they figure that's kind of a low impact way of doing it, and the Germans aren't going to go, the ships weren't there, we don't know why, but it's a leap from there to they must have broken the codes. The Americans are much more aggressive and want to use the information to sink German submarines. So, there's a teaching point in there. How much do you use? Another teaching point is working with your allies. Having allies like the British is an enormous advantage for both sides. And the British benefit from American resources. The Americans are fast learners. The British are good teachers. So much of what we learn in World War II, not just OSS, but I think across the board, comes from the British. And sometimes it's arrogant and hard to accept, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's we're all in this together, and let's do the best we can. One of the little stories that I tell is the director of Bletchley Park, a man named Dennison, has bladder stones, and he's so poorly paid. So this is a guy running basically British code breaking, and he's so badly paid that he can't afford to get a treatment or complete treatment. And so he at a crucial point in the war, he is suffering. He must have been bent double for months on end, and he kept doing his job. And he came over to the States, and he made friends with a guy named William Friedman, who's one of my heroes in the book. And Friedman says, "Hey, we got to go to the doctor. I'm taking you to my doctor," and they get cured. The interesting fact that I don't know is who paid for it, those are so that leads to another teachable moment, which is the power of personal relationships. I think the big success stories come when the British and the Americans manage to get along on a personal basis and even become friends. Some of these friendships last after the war. One of the British code breakers comes here and stays. Brigadier General Tiltman, is that right? Anyway, the Brig, they called him the Brig. And he stays here, and he becomes an NSA employee and winds up dying in Hawaii.
And there's lots of really fascinating characters in your book. You just mentioned one of them. So my question is, if after this event tonight you could go for a beer with one of them, which one would you choose and why?
So I do have definite favorites in the book, and one of them is Joe Rochefort, who is he has not finished high school. He never finished high school. He didn't go to the Naval Academy. He was looked down by the Naval Academy types in the Navy, and yet he's the guy who masters Japanese language. He masters the intelligence about the Japanese Navy. He masters traffic analysis, and he delivers Midway. I don't know if I'd invite him for a drink because he was kind of a difficult character. I would invite William F. Friedman first. Friedman is this brilliant code breaker for the Army, and I think he's a Shakespeare scholar on the side. He's married to his wife is a code breaker in her own right, Elizabeth Friedman, and he just has so many. It'd be interesting to try and get him to talk, to relax and talk, because a lot of the code breakers held things very tightly. But he strikes me as a really sympathetic character. When he retired, he was presented with a retirement card that had 1,300 signatures. So that gives you an idea of how popular Friedman was.
And I think I remember you speaking about Joseph Rochefort, and that he just wanted to be a sailor in the Navy.
Oh yeah.
He just wanted to go out on the ship, but this guy was like a genius. It was basically like Picasso wanting to work in McDonald's or something like that, wasn't it?
So there's at least one ship captain in the room and who will.
I'm being playful.
Who will understand. But the mentality in the Navy was go to sea and stay at sea. If you're a Navy officer, that's what you ought to be doing. And you see that in Rocheford's case, and you see that in the case of an officer named Layton, who was a very qualified intelligence officer for the Pacific Fleet. And after Pearl Harbor, so he thought of Pearl Harbor as his personal failure, as did Rochefort. And he says, okay, I have to do penance. I have to get back back to the Navy, and I have to carry this fight to the Japanese. Admiral, please give me a destroyer. And Admiral Nimitz says, no, you're worth 10 destroyers continuing here at Pearl Harbor. And some of these guys work, in a war where people are transferred hither, thither, and yon, a little period here, a little period there. Some of these guys do just amazingly long tours. I think the longest tour of an intel officer at Pearl Harbor is like 7 years. The guy got there before the war, and even after the war, he's still there for a few months or a year. So a lot of dedication, a lot of hard work, a lot of stress that is not, it's not directly combat related, but it might as well have been.
I was wondering as well, you mentioned that the Second World War has been part of your life since you were young. Is there anything that you came across in your research where you were like, wow, I can't believe I've never heard of this before, or this is surprising to me? Was there any aha moments during your research?
I was predisposed to dislike a lot of the lawyers in the story. Sorry,
there may be a lawyer.
There may be a lawyer or two in the house, and I wound up admiring, and especially though I was predisposed to dislike white shoe Wall Street lawyers, and I wound up really admiring a couple of them. These guys had everything in life. The white shoe lawyers in my book made money off the Depression, right? Because all these businesses are in trouble, and they got to go through a legal process to dissolve them, and who benefits from that? The lawyers, right? So, but these guys, a group of them, say my duty is in Washington or overseas for my country, and they really do some amazing things. My favorite is probably this gentleman, Alfred T. McCormick, who brought order to Army intelligence. But there's other lawyers out there as well that we don't pay that much attention to in World War II. One is Mr. Casey, who becomes director of the CIA after the war. He's a business lawyer. He's more of a nitty-gritty business lawyer than the Wall Street types. I mean, he's the art of the smaller deal, and the Wall Street guys are the art of the big deal. But he puts on the uniform. He looks awful in uniform. He has terrible table manners. People who ate dinner with him said never again.
I believe Nancy Reagan said, watching Bill Casey eat is not for the faint of heart.
Yeah. But anyway, he steps up to the plate and he becomes pretty good. He learns the espionage business and runs pretty good paramilitary ops by the end of the war. Interestingly, he when the war's over, he says, "Okay, that's it. I'm going back to my law practice and doing business law." Some of the others stick around. So Dulles sticks around, or Dulles goes in and out. Donovan wants to stick around, but he's sent home. So anyway, the short answer is I was pleasantly surprised by the contributions that these guys, who's, if you look at them in 1940 or in the 30s, you think, oh, they're just out for themselves. But in the war, you see them distinguish themselves.
Full disclosure, my wife is in law school.
Oh.
And how much does the experience of the Second World War shape how America goes on to fight the Cold War in intelligence terms?
Okay, that's a 500-page question. So there are various ways of getting a handle on that, and one is by looking at Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor is an intelligence failure. We don't have the ability, for various reasons, to know that the Japanese are coming. So there's the Pearl Harbor mentality among the American military, the senior military, and you could boil it down to avoid surprise. And then you add to that the atomic bomb in the late summer, fall of 1945, and it becomes avoid atomic Pearl Harbor. So that's huge. And that is something, the feeling is generally you don't do that by just having code breaking. It's more than code breaking. You need other kinds of intelligence as well. So that those two things combined, you need code breaking. That's the so if you look at it, American intelligence as a family, the code breakers are always the favored child. I mean, there's just incident after incident where you see, oh no, that's good. We'll allow that, or give them more money, or protect them from disclosure, or yes, it's fine if they want to work with the British, and you don't see that with the other INTs, especially the OSS. But there is this sense at the end of the war that we just can't have the fair-haired child. We need the other children too, and so the question becomes, how are those children going to be schooled and organized, and what are we going to do with them in peacetime?
And tell us a little bit more about the process of writing the book. Was it something that you got up and you were like, I'm really looking forward to this, or was it like, purging yourself, or what was it, or do you have a method or a discipline? I always find this such an interesting question.
So there is somebody who knows. Becky and Jay know the whole story between the two of them. I'm a very restless guy, and so I meet deadlines by and large, and so I work very hard going up to a deadline. But sometimes I want to work in this room, sometimes I want to work in that room, sometimes I want to go down to the library, sometimes I want to go to the co-work space. So at the beginning it was kind of hard to get traction. There were days when I was just looking at empty pages, and I didn't think it would come together. But I guess the short answer is my approach is just to start doing it and then adjust from there. So I don't have, I collect my information, I have my sources, I start writing, and then I try and adjust left or right and clean it up to where it's halfway acceptable.
Just before we hand it over to audience questions, one thing that I was interested to know, because you've looked at American intelligence in the round, for this book, you've done so much research. What was the high point for American intelligence in the Second World War, and what was the low point, if you had to choose one?
The high point, I would say, was D-Day, because everything comes together in a remarkable way at D-Day. And you see, if you look at, you can almost quantify how we knew, let's say, what the German defenses were. You can almost quantify the various contributions, and it's aerial reconnaissance is huge. The French resistance is huge because you've got the people who live nearby and who are reporting. You've got code breaking because they can do German order of battle. They can say this division is transmitting from here, and then kind of at the end of the line is the contribution of the. It seems like such a sexy activity should produce a larger contribution. The guys who very brave guys and girls who jump behind the lines and fight the Germans there. But if you're trying to work out who made the bigger contribution, it's they're at the smaller end of the scale.
Well, you've made a great contribution by writing
Well,
this
thank
book,
you.
so thank you.
Tough questions. Come on, folks. Hey, Gil, how are you, buddy?
I think if you go up
sorry.
to the mic, it's just right there. Sorry, yeah.
I understand that Bill Casey worked closely with the English in terms of the spying behind the lines in World War II. And did that continue, that cooperative effort between the English and the United States after World War II?
So the question, well, you guys heard the question, but cooperation with between the British and the Americans after World War II, almost seamless in the field of code breaking, right? So the agreements are sealed before the war is over, and so the fair-haired child is allowed to continue to do what he wants. More complicated in other fields of intelligence, but basically the contact between the British and the Americans is very strong and continues. I like to say, I don't know if I actually put this in the book, but I've said it in a couple of talks, and it's as if sometimes the intelligence tail wags the political dog. So usually it's like countries become friends, you get an alliance, and then there's an intelligence. There's the political alliance, and then there's an intelligence alliance. So, we have the same strategic goals. Let's have our intel guys collaborate. The British and American codebreakers especially are sharing each other's secrets, so it's almost as if they can say to the politicians, hey, we can't afford not to be allies with the British because we've shared all these secrets. Gil.
Nick, if you could talk about a guy who is not one of your favorites, I think. Bill Donovan, is in the book, obviously, and can you talk about his strengths and weaknesses, especially that weird episode right after D-Day?
Sure. So William J. Donovan is one of the Wall Street lawyers, and he goes to Washington. It's more complicated than it's often portrayed. He's an internationalist Republican who from New York, and so there's some friction with the Roosevelt family. They're often portrayed as friends, but there's some friction between the two. Anyway, he is enticed to Washington more by his Republican friends than by Roosevelt. Roosevelt tolerates it. He establishes COI and then OSS, the spy organization we've been talking about. He's a guy who's going in a number of directions at the same time. So sometimes those are great directions and the results are productive. Other times it's like, what were you thinking, Mr. Director? And the specific incident here is he was told not to go to D-Day because he knew too much. He knew the deepest secrets of the Anglo-American alliance, and if he were captured, that would have been a disaster for the Allies. And he was ordered by General Marshall, so that basically the head of the U.S. Army, and he was ordered by the head of the Forrestal, who was Secretary of the Navy, and a couple other people. Don't go to the landing. And he basically disappears for a week and goes to the landing. And so he basically, it's like you turn off your phone and your relatives can't reach you. And he's basically, he takes exactly the risks that they don't want him to take. And he's kind of proud of it, that he wants to make every landing. He's made a number before. And I tell you what, if it was me, I would have fired him. If I'd been President Roosevelt, I would have said, that's it. But President Roosevelt isn't like that. President Roosevelt doesn't like to make sharp decisions like that. Truman would do it, but Roosevelt was more like, well, Bill, let's hear your story. Oh, that's interesting, and then let's go on to the next story. So Roosevelt called himself the juggler, and that was his management technique.
But Bill Donovan already had a Medal of Honor.
Oh,
I don't
yeah,
know.
but we're
I don't
right,
know
yeah.
what else he had to prove.
Yeah, so Donovan had the Medal of Honor and a number of other senior awards from World War One, and it was like it was like, grow up, General. You know, you're in the war starts. I think he's 57, and then he's in his 60s as the war grinds on, and he still keeps wanting to go out literally on the battlefield. The Germans came close. They didn't know it, but they almost captured him on the beach after D-Day. Oof, that's right.
With the advent of computer technology, and in particular hacking, is human espionage, where people are behind the lines or infiltrating the other countries' intelligence, as important as it used to be? And are the people who are doing that generally of sort of the maverick kind of personality that you just described Donovan as having?
So there's a number of ways to answer that question. One way to look at it is it's a little bit like the overlapping sources of information we have. So we have our phones, we have our iPads, we have our PCs, we have television, we have radio. One doesn't replace the other. There's just like one layer after another. I would defer to the people who are actually doing it today, but I would guess the answer is yes. You still need all of them. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a more, in a way, it's a more complicated world. But some of the old-fashioned some of the old-fashioned requirements will, I think, persist forever. So you always want to have you always want to have the president's assistant, right? Or whatever the country is, so your opponent. You would love to know what the president is thinking, and who better to tell you than the guy, and the Soviets were great at this. So the Soviets had the guy in Donovan's office that my friend Mark wrote the book about, and he is telling the Soviets what is in Donovan's inbox. And so, whether it's then or now, I think you always want to have the guy who's emptying the inbox. And
I think one way to think about that is there important information that you can get from human sources you can't get from any other source? And I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, and ideally you want to have them complement each other, but if you get the great thing about signals intelligence is you can see what Tokyo is telling the Japanese ambassador to do, but you can't ask the message how the ambassador felt when he read it and what he planned to do to carry out the instructions in the message. And so if you wanted to do microhistory, I think some people have done this, where you look at the two Japanese ambassadors here in Washington and what these guys were trying to do and how they felt and whatnot. It's an amazing story. Well, at least one of them had an American wife, and so it was just agony for him to see the two countries go to war. Sir.
Hi. I was curious, as our intelligence was developing and aligning with the British in World War II, how did we view the other opposing intelligences, the Germans, the Japanese? Was it a healthy respect, and also the Russians? I was curious.
Boy, good question. So we did not have much respect for Japanese intelligence, and that was largely racist, I would say. The Germans, so then that leaves the Germans, the Italians, and the Soviets. I don't think I don't think we had a deep enough appreciation for what the Soviets were able to do. We wanted, and Donovan makes a trip to Moscow to make friends with the Soviets and work with them against the Germans. I don't know. I think we thought the British were great, and but we were still learning about the espionage business and the code breaking business, and the short answer is that, you know, we had a ways to go before we could appreciate everyone else out there. We had to figure out what we wanted to do, what, you know, and what was important, and then we could look at what the others were able to do.
One of the most fascinating characters of World War II is Moe Berg, the baseball catcher.
Oh, yeah.
And your book seems to be like an administrative history of these events. Either of you, any comment on Moe Berg and the encounter with Heisenberg as being pivotal or more or less important?
Well, a couple comments there. So it's, I would say what I'm trying to do is a foundational history rather than an administrative history, though there's some of that in there, obviously. And so some of these great stories like Moe Berg didn't get into the book. Moe Berg was a baseball player who spoke a number of languages, had spent time in Japan, and was tasked with spying on the German atomic program by approaching so the German scientists used to go to Switzerland for conferences,
right,
academic conferences. And so Moe Berg was supposed to try and get close to him and assess how close the Germans were to succeeding, and then he was said to have been authorized to kill Heisenberg if he thought they were close. So a fascinating story. There's a book. I can't remember the author. Do you?
The Catcher Was a Spy.
Catcher Was a Spy. Thank you. Yeah, that's it. A very good book that talks about him. I don't know. Do you have anything else to add about Moe Berg?
I mean, it's a great story.
Yeah.
I think for stories, World War II is just the gift that keeps on giving,
That's
isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, there's just so many incredible stories.
As long as there's nobody behind me, can one just call the CIA and visit the museum?
No. So it's I don't know if they used to print up pencils and the pencil said the best museum you never saw. So the CIA has a museum, the NSA has a museum. NSA museum's outside the fence, so you can go. The CIA museum is pretty generous about letting people in who have, if you're a scholar and you're working on some topic and they have holdings, they'll let you come. But I have no clearances right now, zero clearances, and so even for me to go and visit the home team is complicated.
I think just on baseball as well, if there's any baseball fans, last year on our podcast Spycast, we had an episode with a former CIA officer, Mark Polymeropoulos, who's a big baseball fan, and the episode is literally called Espionage in Baseball. So I'm sure some of the people in the room will remember the Houston Astros in 2019 for when the Nats won the World Series. But fascinating.
All those trash cans.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm wondering what the somewhat recent trove of intelligence that was declassified, what the impact of that was on your research.
So the short answer for me is none. What I would say is the great thing about working in World War II is I'm reasonably confident that almost everything of value has been declassified. There might be a few documents here and there that just didn't make it through the process, but that's the pleasure of working in World War II. And the OSS is a great example. There are not many spy agencies anywhere in the world where you can look at almost the entire collection of documents relating to its existence. The Stasi maybe comes close, but pretty sure they were shredding a lot of documents in the last days. OSS is a pretty complete collection, so I mean you have a remarkable MI5. The British collections are not. I mean, if you want, you have to know the director and have some special in. And so anyway, I like working on World War II because the secrets I'm reasonably confident are out there. I don't know if anybody Anybody want to challenge me on that? There may be something somewhere, but it would be. I think it would be oversight rather than conspiracy or document destruction. Yeah, Lorenzo.
Question about you said D-Day. I think you said D-Day was one of our intelligence failures.
No,
right?
no. High Point.
Or not
Sorry.
D-Day. I'm sorry. Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
My question is, I've heard and read about rumors that we actually knew Pearl Harbor was going to happen, and I'm just wondering if in your research if you ever came across anything that suggests that. And my second question is, given everything that we've did during World War II and during the Cold War, do you see American intelligence making progress or lessons learned from World War II and Cold War as we enter into this new phase?
So the first question is Pearl Harbor. Did I encounter any evidence that Roosevelt knew and let it happen so that we would get in the war? Short answer is no. It's still a controversial question, and you'll get a lot of debate on that. But I have three reasons. One is Roosevelt was primarily Europe-centric. He didn't really want a war in the Pacific. Another was, if you're going to be a good conspirator, you have to be organized, and he wasn't that organized. And the third was if you wanted to have a conspiracy, you needed to have better intelligence, and we just didn't know. We could see from the diplomatic documents that we were trending towards war, but we couldn't see okay, the attack's going to be over here on this day. It was you could see at that point in December 1941 that war was likely, but you could make a guess that they were going to attack, let's say, the Dutch East Indies. So, well, and then your other question was, are we getting any better?
Yeah, just the
so
lessons learned.
I'll defer to the DNI and the DCI, DCIA on that for the last word, but I think we are. My sense is that this is it's a human business, so it ain't ever going to be 100% right. But we're like somebody who goes halfway to his destination every time, right? So the first steps like from here to there, and then you just keep going half and half and half. You never get to the destination, but you do get closer. So that would be my answer, and I like I say, I'd have to defer to people who are actually on the 7th floor in those buildings now to tell you how well things are working.
And I think that some of that myth comes from, so basically when Pearl Harbor happens, the code, the Japanese diplomatic code, purple, has been broken, so that a message comes through saying that Japan is going to break off peace negotiations with the United States. It doesn't get to the Secretary of State, I think Secretary of State Cordell Hull, until after Pearl Harbor has happened. So again, I think it just goes back to, it's a human business, it's an organizational business. Sometimes things don't get passed along. Sometimes people don't understand the significance of it. And then the question would be, well, if Cordell Hull had got it, would he have interpreted it, well, they're breaking off diplomatic negotiations. Does that mean they're going to attack Pearl Harbor?
Right.
Well, it doesn't tell you that. I mean, maybe you could have inferred that. You could have said, well, we're the most likely to attack. Well, Pearl Harbor may be the place. So there's some stuff going on, but it's not what the myth has became, right?
Or something bad. It's like a weather event. You're reasonably confident there's going to be a storm, but you don't know exactly where it's going to strike. So if you're fairly well organized, you tell everybody in a region, okay, go to the basement for the next couple hours. And in a better world, Washington would have told not just Pearl Harbor, but Pearl Harbor and other places, it would have said, look, we think something really bad is going to happen. Just be ready. And so one of my least favorite people in World War II is Douglas MacArthur. There are two. There's a general and an admiral at Pearl Harbor, and Admiral Kimmel and General Short. And, yeah, they could have done better, but they weren't really bad officers. And they certainly weren't bad people. And they spend the rest of their lives, it's like being the target of an investigation these days. You never get over it. You'd be investigated for this or that, and there's always somebody asking questions. You can't get the job you want. Maybe they pester your family, so on and so forth. Okay, but who does have 8 hours of warning and does nothing with it? That's General MacArthur, right? And what happens to General MacArthur? What is his reward for the disaster in the Philippines? A Medal of Honor. So it ain't always fair. So General MacArthur, I'm not inviting General MacArthur for a drink. Anything else?
Any more questions?
Thank you all for coming. Make great Christmas presents.